Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, this week's episode is special. I'm about as hype as I've been to talk to a guest in quite some time, because this week, our guest is the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, having just been elected at 28 years old, which is absolutely incredible. Ryan Fecteau, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Now, let's get your story. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Biddeford, Maine, so born and raised there, and still live here, and it's the community I represent in the legislature.
Nice. And what role did the Franco-American, French-Canadian identity have kind of in your life when you were growing up?
Significant. My meme, Pepe, and my dad moved from Packington, Quebec in 1964.
Wow.
To work in the textile mills in downtown Biddeford. So my dad, my meme, my Pepe, and my aunt all worked in the mills at one point in their lives. My dad worked there pretty much until they shuttered and the operation was moved south. The identity of the Franco identity for me is pretty intimate.
No, that's awesome. Now, were you around French? Did they speak French in the house?
Yeah, my meme, my Pepe, and my dad speak French, but I unfortunately have not picked it up. So I understand quite a bit, especially when my meme is speaking about food. But otherwise, I don't speak French.
Yeah, you seem to be the same generation then as me and my sis. Kind of the same deal. My parents grew up speaking in the house, but never taught me and my sister. So now, did you ever visit like Quebec when you were growing up to see like cousins and stuff up there?
Oh yeah. So my meme's brother lives in the house that she grew up in.
Awesome.
So it's he's still there, and we would go up in the summer to go visit him up in Packington. So it's a pretty lengthy drive. It's north of Fort Kent here in Maine. So
oh wow.
Straight up to the top of Maine, and then in New Brunswick for a little bit, and then back into Quebec. So
that's a haul.
Sure. It's a haul. When you're in the back seat with your little sister who's 3 years younger than you for 8-hour drive, you can imagine that my dad had his hands full.
Yeah, I have to confess, being from New Hampshire, I didn't really appreciate how big Maine was until Mike and I were heading up to Orono for the Rassemblement, and we're talking about it. We're like, because we had interviewed somebody from Fort Kent. We're like, how much further could it be to Fort Kent? And then it's like, it's a lot further to Fort Kent is the answer.
Yes.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
so
a lot of people consider Bangor and Orono to be northern Maine, but it really is in reality central Maine.
Yes, there's still a ways to go. Absolutely. Do you stay in contact with cousins and stuff?
Well, I have we have some family that have moved here into southern Maine, but
gotcha.
Certainly my meme is the one who does most of the communication with our family in Quebec, mostly because they speak primarily French and don't speak much English. My meme doesn't speak very much English at all, even though she's been here since 1964.
No, I think that's awesome that you still have that personal connection back to Quebec. That's very, very, very neat. Okay, so maybe you could tell me a little bit kind of what your life was like growing up in Biddeford, because I read a couple different places that it doesn't seem like life was always rainbows and unicorns for yourself.
No. I mean, like I said, my parents had divorced when we were fairly young, so my mom had full custody of us, and so we were with her during the weekdays, and we'd go to my dad's on the weekends. So we lived in low-income housing. My mom didn't finish high school; she dropped out after 9th grade. So she worked in the healthcare field, but obviously not in a position that would be, where you'd make the most money, because she didn't have any credentials in order to work in those fields. So she was, she's a low-wage healthcare worker, still is. Yeah, we lived in low-income housing, had an unreliable car. I always remember just thinking, anything that could go wrong financially always seemed to, when you're at the edge of the cliff like that, it seems like the things that could go wrong do go wrong. And it was definitely challenging through basically, almost through 8th grade, I would say. And then my mom met my stepdad, and that certainly helped move us out of the situation we were in, and had a pretty good middle class family living from that point forward. So, but it was definitely challenging. I remember distinctly one day my mom getting a call from her friend letting us know that the J.J. Nissen plant nearby here in Biddeford was giving away excess food that they either had maybe bad expiration dates, but not necessarily the food was bad, or they just had excess.
Sure.
And so we went and grabbed crates and picked up a bunch of food. And I remember like opening the refrigerator, and we had like all of this food suddenly inside the fridge, a family that was living on off of food stamps.
Right.
And I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, we have like all of this, we have all this food now. Like we're set. Meanwhile, of course, the food that was in the refrigerator were the Hostess fruit pies, with like the gelatin,
yeah,
like
absolutely.
lemon and cherry and apple. You look at the nutritional ingredients on those things. It's like saturated fat, sugar, so that's the reality for a lot of families and a lot of kids in here in Maine and across the country. When we talk about food insecurity, we talk about having a lack of access to food, but what we also probably don't talk about enough is an lack of access to nutritional food. It's not one thing to just give people food. We need young people to be able to have access to nutritional food, because it obviously powers their minds and their bodies. So
food insecurity is obviously something you have kind of made one of your main issues your entire time you've been in the legislature, and it is pretty awesome that you have that personal connection to that you can kind of pull on when it comes time, because for a lot of us, it's just something we read about, we hear about other people, but you lived it. That makes it all the difference. Your family, you talked about, came down to work in the mills of Biddeford. Now, and to me, the timeline is kind of interesting, because you would think 1960s, he was kind of late to have groups coming down from Quebec in order to move into town to work in the mills. How long did the mills survive in Biddeford?
Yeah, they were, my family, I guess, would be a late arrival, because obviously there had been plenty of folks from Quebec who had moved to Biddeford prior to 1964. And we didn't have very many family members here already. So, I don't exactly understand the timeline as to what prompted the decision.
Sure.
But it's definitely a question I should ask my dad and my meme. Biddeford Mills were built in the 1800s, and obviously attracted numerous immigrants from across the world. We actually had a fairly large Albanian population in Biddeford.
Oh, wow.
Until the Spanish flu. They were dramatically impacted by the Spanish flu and pretty much wiped out any Albanians that were here. And there's actually a cemetery here in Biddeford where you go through and you immediately see the plot where the Albanians were buried, because the headstones are in a different direction. They're facing Mecca.
Oh, wow.
So it's pretty incredible. And to think, if Spanish flu hadn't occurred and had impacted their community so significantly, Biddeford would not only be a Franco community, but it would be an Albanian community as well. You'd have Muslims and Franco-Catholics in the same community. So, I always think about how different Biddeford could be if the Albanians were not killed by Spanish flu. So anyway, there have been Francos here in Biddeford for many, many years, primarily because of the textile mills, which, still exist in downtown Biddeford. It's probably the biggest landmark in our city. They've been converted into apartments. There's over 100 businesses now in the mills, and it's the bones of these buildings, the skeleton of these buildings are really solid, and it's remarkable to see just sort of the transformation and how the mills, which were the largest economic driver of our town for decades, is still the largest economic driver of our town to come, just in a very different way. Yeah,
it's awesome to see how. Obviously, a lot of these former French Canadian heavy towns, obviously I live in one, I'm in Manchester, have all had to have that same type of, what do we do now experience when the mills start moving out. We get all these buildings. What do we do with them? Different towns have been varied drastically as far as how successful they've been in repurposing them. So it's very awesome whenever to see that is economically successable in different places. Now, actually, speaking of which, I saw you were on the Biddeford Mills Museum board at one point. We've talked a bunch about Biddeford. We talked to Tanya Chevina. We talked to the mayor of Biddeford. I don't know about the Biddeford Mills Museum. So what is this?
Oh, this is great. And perhaps, there's some Francos on the board as well that I'm sure would probably love to come on the show at some point. But the owner of the mill, Doug Sanford, he purchased the mill complex, the majority of the buildings, just after they closed. Everyone thought he was crazy, right? Because
Sure.
Why would you want to buy this big footprint of empty buildings? And
Right.
of course, now we know he was pretty smart in doing so. But the great thing about Doug is he has allowed spaces inside the mill to remain in their pre-existing format, so that there's a sense of what the mills were before the renovation that's occurred. And so the Biddeford Mills Museum has done a great job of curating artifacts from the mills. We have amazing letters. I mean, it was incredible when the mills closed. We kind of got in a group of students along with a teacher, and we had like free reign over the building. Like search through cabinets, and you'd be amazed to see just how many things were just like left there for so long. I mean, we were finding letters that were written from one mill manager to another mill manager down in the South, to in the early 1900s. I mean,
oh wow,
the postmarks still there, the envelope.
That's awesome.
We found the ledgers for the mills. I mean, really significant artifacts. And so all that has been curated there. We have all those things. And then we have there's an event space in the mills that Doug has allowed us to put some historical information and some displays. So those exist as well. And then they do tours.
That's awesome.
Folks from the public can come in and get a sense of what the building was. And we have a couple of former mill workers who tell their own.
Oh, really? That's cool.
Which is fun. And the really cool thing that tops it all off is the mills were not built alongside the river, the Saco River. They were built in the river. So the river would obviously come down into these underground tunnels, and there was a mill that sat on its side, and it would spin, and the conveyor belts ran throughout downtown Biddeford. So there are actually tunnels that would dwarf you and me. They're really large tunnels. And these are where the belts that powered the machinery ran, and it was all water powered. So before electricity existed. So really, really incredible. But you go down into what we call the lagoon, and it's an incredible space. I call it the underground Cathedral of Biddeford, because I mean, they moved massive chunks of granite to build this underground lagoon that powered the mills. And it's a phenomenal site. It really is really quite cool. So if anyone is interested in getting a tour of the mills, I believe you can contact the Heart of Biddeford, and they can help schedule tours, or visit the Biddeford Mills Museum website.
Yeah, and we'll make sure Michael put links to be able to find that when we post this interview. No, that's really neat. Actually, now you mentioned tourism. That is one thing that we have talked about a bit on this show previously, the whole idea of cultural tourism. Obviously had a ton of momentum before crazy COVID world started. And I'm curious, because I know Biddeford is part of that, as is Manchester, Lewiston, Lowell, of the entire idea of putting together a really robust Franco route to be able to link all these towns and kind of put together organized tourist attractions, things that are important culturally for perhaps visitors to come down from Quebec. And I was just curious, how familiar you are with that. What do you think the role of Biddeford is in that? What do you think the future of that is in that, especially now that we are in the crazy COVID world times?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, as you know, I think a lot of our communities are losing, are aging, and so we're losing the memory of some of these significant, the storytelling, the identity of what makes our communities Franco. And I think it's really important that we start to gather the stories, but also find ways to pass on the information to younger generations. And Biddeford had the La Kermesse Festival for many years now, and that sort of has needed some new energy as well. I remember La Kermesse in the early days, you'd have like the Franco music, you had folks from Quebec come down, and we've kind of lost that sense of that festival is to celebrate Franco-American heritage, and not just to eat French fries and fried dough and ride on rides and all that kind of stuff. So it's I think it's a collective challenge that we have as communities that have been historically shaped by Franco-American culture to really gather the stories, capture the stories, and pass on the cultural heritage to the next generation.
Sure. And how do you suggest, because that's something, obviously, that's a major reason why this podcast exists.
Yeah.
How do we do that? What is your vision for what do we do going forward? Because
Really,
obviously that's our goal for all of us.
Yeah. I think that's a good question. I mean, I think it's I think it's community driven in many ways, but it's also, I think one thing that we probably have not done a great job of is we work in silos. So for example, the Biddeford Mills Museum is as much about the mills, but it's also as much about Franco-American culture, because obviously the mills were highly significant to our Franco story here in Biddeford. But we know that's the case for many communities. Lewiston, Auburn, highly shaped by Franco-American culture. And, there's some overlap, but, I don't think we do necessarily a great job of bringing it all together. There in recent years, there was a Franco group that's been started, and the name of it is slipping my mind, here in Maine, that I feel like has done a better job of starting to revive these conversations. And is it French Connection, or I can't quite recall, but they'll be really upset that I don't.
It's all right. We can post it again in our notes.
Yes, yeah. I'll send you the link. But anyway, I think they were starting to, before COVID.
Sure.
We're really starting to bring together these conversations by going to different communities and starting to build like a membership. And I think that's important too. A sense of society that we are together. And it'd probably be great to branch out into New Hampshire as well, and start to build that membership and that partnership beyond the state of Maine.
I mean, that last part, obviously, I think is something, just from my perspective, is super, super important, because I don't think there has been historically enough cooperation between different groups in different states, and even different cities within the same state. And yes. I just don't think we have the luxury to not cooperate anymore. To me, it blew my mind when I went down and checked out, for instance, the Museum of Work and Culture down in Woonsocket. That was the story of us. That's a Franco-American history museum that, until I did this project, I had no idea about. And so I think we just need to do a better job, all of us working together, taking advantage of some of these resources that we have. No, I think that's great.
I agree.
Now, one thing I did want to ask, because I talked about it with the mayor of Biddeford, Alan Castleman, when we had him on the show. And I think it's an interesting question. I think about it a lot, and I don't know the answer, so I'm curious. Maybe you can help me out here. To me, there doesn't appear to be what I'm going to call a, quote, French vote. And I always use the example, my best friend is Greek, so I've gone to a lot of Greek festivals. There's a huge one in Manchester every year. I've been manning a grill a couple times to volunteer. Like I said, I'm good friends with him and his family. At this event, every politician in the entire world, I don't care if you're wanting to run for school board or you are a United States senator, you show up to the Glendy because you want to make sure that you try to get that, quote, Greek vote. Even though there's way more of us here, Franco-Americans, than there are Greeks in Manchester, there doesn't seem to be a, quote, French vote. And I'm wondering if you agree, if you see the same thing in Maine, and if you do, why? Why is this the case?
It's a really good question. I look back and think about the Lucker Mess Parade in the festival again. If you were to turn back the clock even just 5 or 6 years ago, you would see every politician,
sure,
everyone that was seeking a vote in the Lucker Mess Parade or at the festival afterwards. Right. And again, I think the organization around the festival has been challenged by a number of things, financially, and a lack of interest, I think, from the community. And so I think as time has gone on, I think that French vote, as you're describing, I think has been dissolved a little bit. And but I don't think it's necessarily gone. I do think, sure, obviously, there still remain a lot of Francos in our communities, and a lot of people who have a strong identity with their Franco culture. And I just think it needs a little bit of a revival. But I think, something like the Luck Mess Festival here in Biddeford, I think there's a real opportunity for that to be the forum for outreach between elected officials and Franco-Americans.
No, I think that's awesome. I mean, again, just another event we got to probably do a better job capitalizing. But we could probably help more than we do here in New Hampshire, to be honest with you. Something like that.
And if we could regenerate it into something that it once was, I mean, I think it would be a good model for events to happen elsewhere. And maybe it's the same name, but these, smaller spin-offs or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it could be different. but you could still have the same energy, you know,
Yes,
kind of
yes.
thing. So I didn't want to talk. I mean, something that's comes up a lot, especially with this other group that I'm on the board of, the Association for the Advancement of French Language and French Culture in the United States, is the whole idea of French education in public schools, especially because we're seeing fewer and fewer, just across the entire country, fewer and fewer places, public schools offering French as an option in the schools. And I was just curious, what is the situation in Maine? Because you think Maine, you think that's a French state. So
Yeah.
what does it look like in Maine? Do you see the same type of trend, unfortunately, happening where you guys are?
Yeah, it's funny you bring this up because I have a sort of a personal story around this. I originally signed up to take French classes in school. The first time you get introduced to foreign language in Maine schools is in middle school, so sixth
Sure.
grade. I signed up for French, and I quickly became very discouraged because my dad would help me with homework, and then I'd bring it to school, and then I would get everything was being marked incorrectly, and I was like, this cannot be. My dad speaks French. This is
Right.
this is insane. Of course, I quickly found out that my dad speaks Quebecois, and there's lots of variations.
Sure.
He also has, I'm sure, adopted a great deal of slang over the
Of course.
years, and so what's being taught in Maine schools is Parisian French, and so there's some distinctions. So what I find interesting is that we have decided to teach students here in Maine Parisian French, when in fact most students here in Maine would benefit from being able to speak Quebecois.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So it's very interesting in that regard, and I know that there obviously remains significant challenges with foreign languages and trying to keep them intact, especially as Spanish becomes a more prominently used language across the country, and obviously not to a tremendous extent yet in New England, but certainly nationwide. I think there's been more value placed on speaking Spanish. But I know that the Quebec Consulate has been doing some work and providing, I think, grants to schools, and I think they've selected a couple in Massachusetts that have trying to revive the French language in their communities. And I can't quite recall, and you may have had the folks from the Quebec Consulate on before, but
yeah, we talked to them at Poutine-Fest. Actually, the last time we were able to have a Poutine-Fest, we had a booth, and they had the booth right next to us. It was very, very cool. So I'd like to get, I guess,
and I think they're a great resource too, because they become
Absolutely.
more and more active. I mean, from my perspective, they seem to be more active in outreach and being present in communities, and they've done a great job in the last couple of years of being more out there here in Maine, which I've appreciated. They've been co-sponsoring events, and they have a presence in Augusta on a regular basis, and not just we have Franco-American Day at the State House here in Maine every other year, and we have a Franco-American Hall of Fame as well, where we induct Francos into the Hall of Fame. And the Quebec Council has been very, very helpful, but they've been showing up in my first couple of years in the legislature, they would show up just for that one day. But now they seem to be showing up more frequently for other events as well, which is great, and hosting their own events.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, huge resource that we could hopefully use to coordinate our efforts throughout New England. I think it would be very, very cool. So now let's get to your story a little bit then, your career. How did you end up getting involved in politics?
Well, I went to the Catholic University of America in D.C., so that certainly helped for my interest in politics being, in the capital. But really, my interest in coming back home after I graduated in 2014 and running for office, my last semester at Catholic, I was coming home nearly every weekend to knock doors because I had a primary opponent. So, I graduated in May of 2014 and had a primary election in June. So,
oh wow,
I came home and I had a month, left of the election. So I had a lot of work to do. I knew that I had a lot of work to do before I actually had moved back home. So I was, knocking doors and doing all that stuff in the winter, and had my best semester at Catholic because I think I had so much time on trains and airplanes to actually do my work. And I didn't procrastinate so much. But anyway, my real interest in coming home and representing my community here in Biddeford was the fact that Maine is the oldest state in the country. A lot of my peers had already moved away or had no intention of moving back.
Sure.
Or they were going to school at UMaine or in the UMaine system, and they wanted, as soon as they graduated, they were ready. They wanted to go somewhere else, and that was discouraging to me. I felt like Maine has so much opportunity. We have such a we have such close-knit communities, recreational opportunities. We have a beautiful state. And
Absolutely.
I wanted to be part of the conversation that was happening in Augusta about how we could attract young people back to Maine for the first time, to get them to stay. And I felt like, looking at the representation we had in Augusta, I didn't feel like young people were necessarily at the table. My state rep, who was termed out in 2014, was in her 80s. And so overnight, when I got elected, the district went from an 80-year-old to a 22-year-old. Quite a drastic change in
I would say,
leadership.
yeah, I would think so. No, that's awesome.
Another Franco, though, a Baudouin. So.
Well, of course. No, we expect nothing less from Biddeford. But yeah, no, that's awesome. Now, you became, I guess maybe you ended up on a lot of people's radars, I should say, with your efforts to ban conversion therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us, first of all, why was that so important to you? And talk a little bit about the battle to actually, because you were successful to actually get that done.
Yeah, it was a tough battle, because I put the bill in. Well, at first I should say, for those who are unaware, so-called conversion therapy is the practice of getting someone who is a trusted individual, usually someone with a position of authority. In many cases, someone who may even have obtained a license from the state to practice, psychology or something of that nature. And it's this discredited practice, widely discredited practice that is ultimately harmful, that is telling young people that who they are is wrong and that they need to change, primarily in the context of having, a young person who identifies as LGBTQ. And, I felt very passionately about this issue because I had an experience where I did not go through conversion therapy, but I was suggested literature by a trusted individual, someone who I really trusted a great deal, that was a book written by someone who had gone through conversion therapy and suggested that it worked. And, just that experience of having someone that I trusted tell me to pick up this literature and to see beyond my gayness really had a huge impact on me psychologically and emotionally. It led to some really dark times for me personally. And I had just a brush with this concept of conversion therapy, very surface level. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be a 16 or 17-year-old who's come out to your parents, which is a very difficult thing to do for many young people. And to be told that, we're going to get you help. We're going to bring you to someone who's going to change who you are.
Yeah.
So we got the bill submitted in my second term, ultimately got it through a Republican controlled Senate. It was vetoed by our governor at the time, Paul LePage, who was the first governor in the country to veto such a bill. New Hampshire, I think just a few months before, Republican Governor Sununu signed the exact same bill into law. So it's quite the contrast to see between the two. Fortunately, we came back with the bill this past 2 years, and Governor Mills signed the bill into law. And so here in Maine, that practice is, as it is in New Hampshire, prohibited and completely unacceptable.
Yeah, no, I was there for that. I've done a couple of stints in the New Hampshire House, and I'll put it out there now. I've seen tons. I've seen lots and lots of floor speeches from my time in the legislature, and the speech you gave specifically on this bill is something we've got a link to. It's available through your website. It is absolutely awesome. Super powerful. Just an amazing talk. You can obviously, anybody who's going to spend the 15 minutes or whatever it is to watch that is going to understand how you got to where you are, because it's really, really terrific. And I guess maybe it says something about me, but I was surprised because obviously a lot of us in the Franco world are talking about, when it was pretty clear you were going to be the next Speaker of the House here. And the conversation, at least me and my circles always had about, I cannot believe that there's a 28-year-old who's about to be Speaker in Maine. What surprised me, I guess, and maybe it shouldn't have, but what surprised me was when I look at a lot of the national coverage, it seems to be more, could you believe it's going to be a gay person who's about to be Speaker in Maine? So I'm just curious how you are viewing, because obviously you're getting known all over the place now, how the coverage of your election's being covered now.
Well, I keep saying to myself, I can't believe no one's covering the fact that I'm the first speaker from Biddeford.
There you go.
There's never been a speaker from Biddeford, Maine. I'm very proud that for the first time in our state's 200-year history, I've brought the speakership to my hometown of Biddeford. I think that's something I take a great deal of pride in. I'm obviously very proud of the fact that for the first time in Maine, we have an openly gay speaker. I know that has significant meaning to young people, especially to see that, they have leaders. I grew up without knowing any LGBTQ leaders.
Sure.
I didn't know who Harvey Milk was until I was 20 years old,
Oh, wow.
working on a marriage equality campaign. And we for a volunteer night, we played the movie Milk, and I watched it for the first time and found out who Harvey Milk was, who's
Sure.
a pioneer of LGBTQ rights, someone that I should have known about, but I didn't. And it's odd to grow up in a world where something that is so obviously significant about who you are, and you don't have people that you don't even know your own history, right? I
Right.
did not know who fought for my rights before I was on the front lines fighting for marriage equality. So I'm very proud of that. But I think it is significant that I will be the youngest speaker in the country. I think it's a sign of the times. Young people are more engaged than ever before in the political process. They are dissatisfied what's happening in their own communities,
Sure.
in their states, in this nation, in this world. There's too much on the line, and not that I expected that I would be the youngest speaker in the nation, but I'm not surprised that there is one, because someone who's under the age of 30, because now is the time for young people to engage the process, because it's our futures at stake, and there's not a lot of time to solve the climate crisis, to solve the growing amount of student loan debt that exists in this nation. We need to be part of the conversation and to assert that our futures are on the line ultimately.
No, that's absolutely 100% true. And obviously, actually, feel free to punt this question, but it just occurs to me now that one of the things that you see in what you've put out there when you talk about yourself is the fact that you are a proud Catholic, which is something obviously pretty consistent with the Franco heritage. How do you resolve that with the fact that you're also gay? Because that's something that, again, has come up time and time again.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, I have always believed, regardless of the issue, and this is how I approach politics as well. If I'm not at the table, things are never going to change. And so,
love that.
If every person who supported LGBTQ rights, or who themselves was LGBTQ, left the pews and left the Catholic Church, it would be a sounding board for the same ideas and the same beliefs. And that's not how we create change in America. It's not how we create change in our spiritual lives as well. So I see it as fundamentally important that I remain true to who I am. Catholicism is an identity for me. I mean,
Sure.
It's who I am, how I was raised, and I belong in the church just as much as anyone else. And so I see that as very important to me, that I don't give up on the church. I don't feel like that would be the right thing to do.
That's awesome. I love that answer. Okay, so now what's the goal now? So you're speaker. We're living in a pretty crazy time. What is on your agenda for boxes you got to make sure you check in your first term here as Speaker of the House?
Yeah, it's going to be a really challenging session. Obviously, we're not only dealing with how we logistically do the business of the legislature during a pandemic,
right?
But we're also dealing with a financial situation for the state that is pretty bleak. We have a budget deficit that we need to solve, and it's going to be challenging. But with that being said, I remain optimistic about the things that we can do as a legislature, in terms of making sure that the folks that have been most impacted by this pandemic are not forgotten and not left behind, and that they receive their due, especially our healthcare workers who have been on the front lines,
right.
Those who have been deemed essential workers, those who've been bagging our groceries and helping us, find the items that we need in the grocery.
Absolutely.
While being in the presence of, hundreds of different people every day. We need to make sure we recognize and give them their due. Our educators, our teachers who have been, teaching students over Zoom and in person, even sometimes at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our young people who are having to learn in new ways, especially those who, face learning challenges, whether they be behind in reading or math, or they have a learning disability. I really find it, very important that we make sure that they're getting the resources that they need. I don't want them falling behind. And those are the students that are susceptible to falling through the cracks. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I think, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, are up for the challenge. And I think now more than ever, recognize the need to overcome the partisanship, the gridlock, because, you know, in a crisis like this, under these circumstances, the only thing our neighbors care about is making sure that we do our jobs and we do right by the people of the state of Maine. And that's my intention, and that's how I'm going to lead.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I do not envy kind of the challenge that you have. I'm just thinking, trying to come up with a budget projection right now. How do we calculate the impact of, because obviously commerce between your state, my state, and Quebec is huge, and that's been hugely impacted. How do we get that back rolling again? There's a lot of challenges you got coming up.
Yeah, I was actually up in Calais a few weeks ago, which is a border town.
Right.
And it was interesting to hear, you know, it was actually a couple of days after Trudeau announced that they were going to extend the border closure. And I was just thinking, you know, there's so many families there that where they have family on both sides of the border, and they can't cross to see their mother, perhaps, or their uncle, or their aunts. And of course, working, they can cross the border for the purposes of work. But I mean, the challenges that are presented to communities in Maine, where, you know, that relationship of the border is pretty significant. And under any other circumstance, you know, crossing the border would be like going from one town in Maine to the other.
Right. No, absolutely.
You know, that relationship is so close. So it's a very bizarre time. Very bizarre time. Yeah,
it's funny you reminded me, because we did way back, seems like a lifetime ago. Back in March, we did a special kind of when COVID started impacting everyone, and we were speaking with somebody from Fort Kent. In fact, we was talking about how she was on one side of the border. She was in obviously Fort Kent. She had her parents and her kids were on the Canadian side, and for the entire history of that area, it had never been an issue, because whether it was two countries, same country, whatever, it was always treated as one like giant, you know, community across this border, like you mentioned, just going back and forth like it was nothing. And all of a sudden now they can't see each other. And it was, I mean, I can't even imagine being in that situation. It is crazy.
It's going to be interesting to see when we get to that next deadline concerning the border, what the decision will be. Obviously, things have not improved at all here in the United States since Trudeau extended the closure. So
yeah, I'm hoping, I was supposed to do my 6 months in Quebec City 2020, something. I'm rooting pretty hard for this vaccine so I can get up there in 2021.
Yes.
One thing I do, this has been awesome, by the way, but I got to make sure to ask before we go, because I think it's super interesting for me. On your Twitter page, first of all, I always find it interesting because, you know, when you put yourself out there on Twitter, you got like 2 lines to kind of say who you are, what you're about. And so I always find it interesting what people include in those couple of lines. Like, what if you only could say 3 or 4 things about yourself total, what would you want the world to know about yourself? In your case, you list 4 of them, and one of them is proud Franco-American, which I think is absolutely awesome. Why is it so important to you? Why is it crucial to you that if people know nothing else about Ryan Fecteau, they know you're a proud Franco-American?
I just think it's so fundamental of who I am and how I've lived. You know, I grew up with a meme and a pepe, and you know, I had, you know, a dad who worked in the mills, and along with many other Francos. You know, it is so fundamentally part of my identity and who I am, and I'm proud of that culture and the community that we have here in Biddeford. Because I also know that it was never something that was easy.
Sure.
For a lot of Francos here in Biddeford and elsewhere, you know, we were a community that was targeted for being Catholic, right? For
absolutely.
Speaking French, those things that I think, you know, maybe my meme and pepe were ashamed of, because they were trying to assimilate and try to fit in.
Sure.
They're things that I want to make sure people know that I'm proud of. You know, I don't want to be, I have no shame in the fact that I grew up with a meme and pepe, and that you know, my dad speaks French and my meme speaks French. I'm proud of that. And I want to make sure that people know that. And so it's an interesting thing, because obviously I'm somewhat removed from some of the, you know, real cultural identities, speaking French, for example. But in many ways, I feel like I'm as close to them as ever, especially as I grow older and have a greater appreciation for them.
That's awesome. This is I gotta tell you.
If only I had the appreciation when I was younger, because then maybe I would have learned French.
I feel the exact same way. Maybe I wouldn't need to go to Quebec City for 6 months to be able to pick up the language. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna hopefully before I'm 40 years old, I want to be able to have a fluent conversation with my parents in their first language. That is my goal. But anyway, I got to tell you, this has been absolute honor for me. I know a major motivation for this podcast right from the very beginning is when I had been told time and time again that, French Canadian heritage is dead, or if it's not dead, it's at least dying. And my reaction to that has always been that it's not dead, it's different. It's not dying, it's changing. And I actually really think this is a super exciting time to be a Franco-American, because I do think the steps we are taking now has a pretty big impact on what the Franco-American identity scene is going to look like for my nephew and the next generation going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess this has been me being on my soapbox. Long-winded way of saying, not sure there's a better example of why Franco-Americans should be excited for the future than Ryan Fecteau, Speaker of the House for the state of Maine. Ryan, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show. Anything Mike and I could do here at the French Canadian Legacy to help you out ever going forward, please let us know. And now if somebody wants to get in touch with you or find out more information, maybe, volunteer for donate to a campaign, where can we send them?
Twitter is the best place to find me, I think. so, sometimes for better or for worse, but at Ryan Fecteau on Twitter, also on Instagram, and ryanfecteau.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ryan. Really appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Jesse. Appreciate being on the show.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.